College political scientist, Tony Stewart.
Good evening, and once again, welcome to the North Idaho College Public Forum. On behalf of the panel, it is a very special privilege this evening to welcome to our program our guest, Lee Piper. Lee Piper is a member of the Cherokee Indian Nation. At the present time, she serves in the position of Minority Affairs Director at Highland Community College in Seattle, Washington. In addition to her endeavors in that position, she is affiliated with many organizations that relate to American and Native issues and peoples, including among her affiliations are a member of the Indian Cultural Center Advisory Board. She is also a member of the Northwest Intertribal Council, the American Indian Women's Service League, the United Indians of All Tribes Foundations, the National Indian Education Association, and she is also a member of the Governor's Indian Advisory Council in the state of Washington. Lee, on behalf of the panel, it is a great privilege to welcome you to our program.
Thank you.
I also am pleased to welcome to the panel this evening, to my far left, Mary Lou Reed, who is very active in community affairs in the state of Idaho and the Northwest in both partisan politics and environmental circles. She holds a degree from Mills College and did graduate work in religion at Columbia University. Welcome back, Mary Lou.
Thank you, Tony.
Also, it's a privilege to once again welcome back Janelle Burke, who holds a bachelor's degree from the College of Idaho, a master's degree from the University of Indiana, and for 5 years was Dean of Women at Idaho State University. Once again, Janelle, welcome back.
Thank you, Tony.
We'll proceed to questions at once in the first series from Mary Lou Reed.
Well, Lee, you have been involved in the Native Americans' rediscovery of his heritage and in the search for identity. Would you talk to us about what some of this entails when you're doing this process of rediscovering the language and rediscovering the culture? How do you go about getting this across?
I guess that I'm a little bit unique in that, being Cherokee, we have never really lost our language. And we have both written and a spoken language, which has been ours from time immemorial, for long before the white man came. Sequoia, who was, of course, a very noted person among our people, very, very much beloved and honored, invented a method of putting our Cherokee language into print, so that we were then able to print newspapers and publications of that sort. We have, Cherokees have, of course, continuously attempted to retain much of the heritage and culture and to keep up the language. We have made great strides today in that the language is now taught in all of the schools in the Cherokee Nation. The elementary schools, we do teach it. We also have courses at Northeastern State College in Oklahoma so that you can take it there. We have the language put on tapes. We have books. We have just about anything you'd want to learn. The people within the coast area where I'm living today, the Native people, have attempted to bring back much of their culture. They hold language classes. Tulalip is holding language classes. Puyallups are holding language classes. They have some of the elders who are able to speak the language who are coming in and teaching the language classes. Other tribes, the language is lost and they are not able to bring it back. But they are attempting to teach the children much of the heritage, the dances, the songs. The smokehouse activities have been reactivated, and the people of the communities are again taking an active part in these things and bringing back their religion and some of the activities that had gone on in the Longhouse in the long time ago days. It's a slow process, bringing back a culture, primarily because the parents, the age group who would be instrumental in doing this come from a time when boarding schools were in high evidence. We still have a few boarding schools, but in those days you were taken from your home and sent off to the boarding schools. My mother the young people's parents of today. And so they had rather an unpleasant, a very unhappy kind of association with school and their culture because they were denied this. They were taught to be ashamed of parents, to be ashamed of language, to be ashamed of religious activities, to be ashamed of anything that was considered Indian. And so they came from a time when they were denied this. They came home to parents from a boarding school who thought, the best thing for my child is not to have them have any part of the Indian culture, and therefore they won't have to suffer humiliation and the hurt that I have. And so the parent, again, didn't reinforce or bring out heritage or history or the language to them. And so they became kind of a neutered Indian, that they had no chance of learning the history, no chance of being a part of the community and the culture, no chance of learning the language. We came to a time about 10 years ago when young Indian people, along with the rest of the world, where the young people decided, hey, we're not a mass product, we are individuals, we have a right to be ourselves, we have a right, certain rights that belong to us, and so maybe we should start demanding that we be allowed to be ourselves, to be individual, to seek out, to investigate, to find ways of expressing ourselves, to find the road that we wish to follow. And so the young Indian people were the same. And they fell back on the heritage because the white man's world did not satisfy their needs. They had not satisfied their mothers, and so they weren't satisfying the young. They were not getting any kind of a substitute for the culture that had been taken away, and so they were back to look at the culture and see what it was that caused this lacking. And in the last 10 years, we've had both the militant and the passive. We've had the reservation and the urban due to relocation. And so we've had kind of a dividing which has been used by the establishment to further divide our people. And I suppose it all kind of goes back to a basic philosophy from the 50s saying termination, which is a bad, bad word. And we became pretty horrified, and we said, no, you're not going to terminate. We're going to be Indian. We'll always be Indian. We retain the land. We will retain our culture. And by George, we're going to go back and get it. And since that time, that's where our steps have headed. We want to go back and pick it up. That doesn't mean that we're going to give up riding in a car. It does mean that we'll be able to look with pride at our ancestors and say, hey, you weren't all that right. You aren't all that great. We have some pretty good greatness ourselves, and therefore we have a right to let it be known.
You've opened up so many, many windows. Can I just focus on one in terms of response? Are you getting the same response from Native Americans of all ages, or is this bringing more of a chord of response from the young people, or do you feel that this is a unified effort of the tribal cultures to work together to seek this pride and this identity?
I really do think that all of the people are coming together to bring back the old moral and ethic values of the Indian people. I think that they want to share the culture, that they want to retain it, they want to be a part of it. And of course there are always exceptions to the rule, but I really feel that most of the people, urban, reservation, rural, in-betweens, whatever, they really do want to be proud of their heritage, that they really do want to know about it and learn about it, that they want to preserve it because it has a great value. We really have something to offer. I think the white man could well learn from us many things, and we have learned many things from him. Learning how to use an alarm clock isn't all that great, but it comes in handy if you don't want to miss the plane. And we do ride the plane once in a while, too. You know.
Thank you.
Janelle Berg.
I'd like to follow along on the same line as Lou was talking about. How do you, as an Indian parent, teach your children to respect, to love, to appreciate and practice the Indian culture while still maintaining a realistic, practical approach to everyday life? You're talking about the alarm clock. At the same time, how much of the culture do you want your young people to practice? How much of the culture do you want them to appreciate and enjoy? How do you mesh the two worlds together?
Well, I want my children and my grandchildren, and of course I deal with my grandchildren today, I want them to know about and retain all of the culture that is possible for them to retain. I don't see a great difference. I don't see that I cannot teach my child the moral and ethic values of the American Indian, of our people, and that won't fit in today's world. I think that he can be and has a right to be honest, that he has a right and can be truthful, and that he does not have to be disrespectful, that he can respect others, he can respect the elders, he can respect other people and their dreams, other people and their ideas. He can be taught these things and still live in the world today. I think that the non-Indian people really try to do that themselves in the beginning, but then they get to a materialistic thing, and I don't think the educational system helps it. I think they really help promote materialism. I think that we can still teach our child to be giving, to be loving, and yes, he will suffer probably from children in his school, in his block, who perhaps would try to be domineering, but you can teach him to walk away from that too. I really don't see as it will be so difficult now, once that he doesn't have to be ashamed. And that to me is the big part, is that you don't have to be ashamed. You don't have to hang your head and say, oh, your grandmother's an old squaw, which to me is swearing. That's calling her names. It's making bad reference. They do that to their own, too. You know, the non-Indian people make derogatory remarks to each other. So I don't think it's so terrible to teach my grandchildren, or having had taught my children, to be respectful of others. I think you can do it. I think that there's nothing in our heritage that won't fit today. I think we were progressive in the long time ago days. If the Indian found a better way to kill the animal, to make a knife, to skin an animal, to make a home, or to get over the mountain, he did it. He was just as progressive as anyone. He wasn't materialistic, and I think that makes a difference.
What about occupations? Do you think that the American Indian young people are going into the traditional occupations, the farming, the land, living from the land, as much as they once did, or do you think they're entering other occupations?
I think that they're probably doing both. Those who can go back to the land, if there is an opportunity to go back to the land, and we have a great upsurge to do this. It's, well, not only Indian, but non-Indian. He wants to get back to the farm. But many of our people do follow regular vocational fields. Some of them work at Boeing's, and some of them are in the Army, and some of them are teachers, and we have very few doctors. We need more. We need more people in the health fields. We need more people in the technical fields. Hopefully we'll be able to train people to do all the administrative jobs, all of the educational and vocational fields, and then we can all go back to our reservation or home areas and build our own communities, because our communities are really very poor. Poor housing, poor sanitary conditions, and poor nutrition, which all tend to put us down, to kill us off at an early rate. And perhaps by getting our people educated without denying them their culture, we can bring up our standard of living and then not be a burden on anyone else. We don't want to be a burden on anyone else. We don't want to be a burden on ourselves. We want to live in peace and harmony with the earth and the world around us. We want to get along with the environment. You know, that doesn't eliminate the white man either. You know, there's room for all.
Lee, in your presentation to the student body at the college today, you went through a list of contributions that the American Native or American Indian has given to the white society, and a most impressive list. And I was wondering if you would take a few moments to give us some examples from that list for our viewing audience.
Well, probably one of the biggest contributions was that over 50% of the food you eat today came from the American Indian. Just to name a few, of course, number one grain seller is corn. Had several varieties of corn, many varieties of beans, and I would like to make a comment towards chilies, tamales, tortillas, frijoles. Were never heard of by the Spanish before they got to Mexico. And we have a little joke that it was the Chicanos who were cooking chili, that the aroma brought Cortez right into the heart of the city. We, of course, Indian guides were the prime people who led the frontiersmen, the early charters from Europe through the continent, took them over all the streams, guided them across the country and on Indian trails, Indian byways. They could identify canyons, they knew routes and shortcuts, and they took the foreigners from coast to coast, which it would have taken them much longer if they had not utilized the Indian guides. But Indian guides have never been really given credit for all this great work and knowing, of course, many of the medicinal plants, how to help people. And I might make a note here that the method of fixing fractures came from the American Indian. When the Europeans came here, in Europe, if you fell and broke your leg, if you landed and your leg was bent like this, that's the way you were the rest of your life. They didn't know how to straighten that. And when the colonists were first here in the 1600s, they watched and observed our people setting fractures. And from that, they knew how to help the people from Europe back in their homeland.
Mary Lou Reed.
Lee, you have mentioned language and songs, and could I ask you to tie this in with Indian religion? What part do the religious ceremonies now play in your Indian culture? Is this a cultural thing, or are your religious ceremonies still valid and meaningful?
I think that they're very valid and meaningful. Not all of the Indian people follow Indian religion of their respective tribes. There's been, of course, a very successful job of apostolizing by the Christian religions, and they have taken Indian people into the respective churches. Indian people were basically a very religious people, living close to God and nature, knowing that our very existence depended upon God and the environment in which He had set us. And so it was not uncommon to have our people go to the Christian religions when we were denied our own, to try and keep up this spiritual unity. And so we have people, Indian people today, in just about every church that there is. We do have a big swing among youth, and the people from the old days who had followed Indian religion becoming more active in Indian religion, and as we say, bringing some of the younger people back to it. I've always followed Indian religion, and I don't go any other way. We believe in one God, creator of all things, and He is us, and we are He, and He is in all of us, and we're in Him. So we're all part. He is the trees, the grass, everything that grows. We're all part of it, part of this universe He made.
That's very eloquent. Can I ask you more specifically about your Cherokee religion? Do you have a doctrine or a systematic time of meeting, or do you have religious ceremonies at different parts of the year?
We have 6 major ceremonial days, particular days, but with Indian religion is a 24-hour day, every day of the week, every hour or week of the year. It isn't one day of week. We don't go to a box and open it and say, hey, today's the day, thank you, it's been great, and close the box up and go out and steal. Religion to us is something that we have to deal with at all times. everything that we do, every breath that we take is a part of religion. And our religion is one of thanksgiving and not asking.
I think you have quite a bit to teach all of us.
Janelle Berg.
I wonder if you might talk to us just for a minute about the self-government system of the Indians, the tribal councils, and what their positions are, and how they relate to one another. I know that you have been interested and involved in the Inter-Tribal Council, haven't you, of the Northwest? How do they relate to one another?
Well, I try not to get too deeply involved in Indian politics. It's like most politics, you really got to have a feel for it or be involved in it that way. In the old days, just let me backtrack for a minute. In the long time ago days, the government of Indian people was by Indian people, and of course this concept was what the American government was based on. And everyone had a voice within that government. Well, they came along after we lost the wars, and they fenced us within the little dabs of land we had and allowed us to keep the reservations. Our government became rather static. The people were still there, but our government didn't have any real strong function except perhaps to kind of hold the people together. And in about 1934, they had the Reorganization Act, in which the government says, hey, we've been pretty bad to all of you, and we're going to do you this great big favor and let you become your own council again. We're going to let you govern yourself again. That's what they said out loud, and that's kind of the way it was. But when you read the small print and behind the table and underlines, it infers that your council, you can have a council, but we'll pull the strings. And many of the tribes have very successful tribal councils that work well with the people, and the people work with it. They get a lot of pressure, a lot of harassment from the government, but they still work pretty well. Other tribes have a great deal of problem. They're dictated to, and they are run from outside forces. And one thing, you know, Indian people are like anyone else. Not all of us are good. Some of us are bad. And I had a very difficult time adjusting myself to the fact that perhaps not all Indians were good. Some of them may be low-down, dirty rats. But eventually you have to face that fact, and that it does happen. And sometimes we have people in our politics and government who really aren't all that great. They really are white with Indian blood. And they're not Indian with white blood. And there is a difference. And that goes with many races. You know, I'm always hearing from people who say, well, my ancestors, of course, particularly Cherokees, my great-grandmother was a Cherokee princess, you know, and I really have a soft feeling for you. Well, we didn't have princesses, but their grandmother may have been Indian, but that doesn't make them Indian. They are white people who have some Indian blood. I know other people who live Indian, think Indian, act Indian, they are Indian. And they are Indians with some white blood. And there is a difference.
Can you tell us how the government defines the American Indian?
Well, he tries not to do that any more than absolutely necessary. The BIA came up with a stock idea of when you breed stock, you can come up with a specific blood quantum, and they use 1/4 blood as being identified as Indian, and that would be a breed. My birth certificate says I'm a full blood, but that's not quite true. My grandmother said my great-grandmother was a German princess, so that makes me 1/4 white.
I have a political question for you too, Lee. During the Nixon administration in particular, and in recent years, there has been much talk in the national government and in the Congress about a government policy for self-determinism for American natives. Do you think that that is understood within the national government? What is your reaction to what has been attempted in that area? Is the government really responding to what American natives are asking for in relation to self-determinism?
I think they may do some a very small amount. I think they may have some tokenism. I think that the Indian people can and will be able to carry out self-determination if the government will cooperate and allow them to do this. But I still feel that termination is a big part of the American government's theme song, and that they have camouflaged this with self-determination. I think that they're only trying to catch us off guard. I think they're trying to get our interest in something else, and that as soon as they can, there's a lot of raw materials, there's a lot of forestry, mining, a lot of things on these reservations that the money man wants, and he is not going to lose sight of that, and he's not going to give it up. I think that we have a big fight on our hands. Self-determination can be a good thing if we're allowed to carry it out, and we want that. We have a right to think for ourselves. We have a right to do the things that we feel we need to make make our lives better. I think that termination is still a major part of the government's policy. I really do.
Do you think that it is possible to have a much larger voice by the American natives themselves as long as we have the present structure? In other words, I am asking, what is your position on the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the policies that it attempts to carry out?
Well, I guess, you know, the Indian, he cusses and damns the Bureau, but, and the Bureau needs a real good overhaul. But we also need the Bureau from the standpoint it is the one thing that reinforces the fact that we are sovereign Indian nations and that we need a special agency in which the federal government deals with our nations through. And this agency should be operated by Indian people, working in behalf of Indian people. And the people working there should be sponsored by Indian tribes, Indians themselves, and not just blackmailed or harassed or sold out Indian people who are put in there as fixtures.
Mary Lou Reed.
What event or what happened, do you think, that made the Indians realize that perhaps this policy of termination was not in their best interests? I grew up near the Klamath Indian Reservation. Of course, it was one of the celebrated reservations which was dissolved in the 50s, and this was lauded as a fantastic step both for the country and for the Indians. And what really brought the Indians up short to recognize that this was not something that they wanted?
Well, I think most of the tribes never really wanted termination. Some of the tribes who had lost most of their culture, and the Klamaths were one of them, had very little culture. They did not have the language. I have personally talked to some of them that didn't even know what their ancestors wore, what kind of ceremony they may have had, what kind of a religion may they have. Now, I'm sure that there are some people within that nation who could remember, but I'm saying that the average person there did not. They had really lost their culture. And they thought that the best thing to do would be get a large sum of money, that would help them, it would solve some of their problems. But of course it did not. It only made it worse. It's very, very bad. Klamaths, all of them are just about broke now and have very little, and And more than that, they don't even have a home to go to.
Of course, they did have very, very rich timberlands. Well, do you think this kind of example was what alerted the other Indians, or do you think there were some world events like following the Korean War, World War II and Korean War, where relocation did not seem to be satisfying, that there was a renewed feeling of a need for a sense of place, for a place?
Well, I think they always felt a sense of belonging in the reservation areas, or those home territories or places where they live, because all Indians do not have reservations, but many live in certain localities, and so they belong to that locality. I think that World War II helped to open Indian eyes to the fact that this outside world isn't all that great, that this outside world is really cheating them, and that they have a right to a good way of life just like anyone else. And so when they went back home, coming back from the war, they found that the conditions on the reservations or within those rural localities were very, very poor, and that perhaps if they got out of that, and here's where the BIA jumped right on it, well, we'll relocate you, we'll train you in a profession, we'll teach you a job, we'll take you to this urban center, and things will be really great. One of the things we really have never lost, and that is our sincere desire to believe. And we still give the non-Indian the benefit of the doubt that maybe this time he'll be truthful. So we believed again. And they took our people in. They paid 6 months rent, maybe a year. Started them on a vocational training program, and at the end of that time, wham, it's all over. And here they were, dumped in the large cities. They no longer had any help. They were not trained to do a job, and they literally became a part of the ghetto system. Indian people do not usually, within the large areas, live in consolidated groups like the blacks would have a central area, specific area, and that would be where they would all center. Indian people live all over. They've been moving for thousands of years, no reason for them to change today, and so they like driving here or there, moving here or there to visit, to have action, this freedom of moving about, and so they live all over the cities. And they had a great deal of trouble getting any kind of welfare help, getting any kind of the programs that the government had in action, like with model cities. They had lots of trouble getting programs funded through those sources. And so we had a lot of people who were literally starving to death in the cities. And we had young people who were being denied their culture because there was not an opportunity to teach it to them. In more recent years, we have been able to change that, bringing about some of the Indian organizations and building up programs where we can look after one another, see that everybody has food, help each other find jobs, see that people have a place to stay, and then putting in the culture programs. We in Seattle, we have United Indians Foundation has culture classes twice a week, and in the 4 areas of, and I'll talk about Seattle specifically, the Seattle area. We have them going on in outreach areas too, but in Seattle, you can go, anyone is welcome to these culture classes. We teach you about, what they usually do is they get a list of all the people, of the tribes that are represented. And it's amazing, but if you have 50 people there, you'll probably have 49 tribes. So then you start with, what would you like first? And so you give them what they want. And it's been very successful. We've had some real success with that. We still have about half the people on the reservation, half the people are in the urban centers. I guess it's a long whole line from World War II, sudden awareness that you are a human being, that you have as many rights as anyone else, and that there is a way to obtain or to make these rights known and to get yourself in a position of having a better economic standard of living. And I guess we've just sort of come down from that. Today, more than ever, we have more people in the school system, in the colleges, in the trade schools, learning how to have a good living. That doesn't mean everyone's going to go back to the reservation today or tomorrow, but it's certainly a future goal. I think we all are looking forward to going back and having our own stores, our own shopkeepers, our own doctors and nurses manning the health clinics and the hospitals, and going in and not having to feel worried or afraid because the other person on that desk is going to be another Indian, and you can feel comfortable with that.
Janelle Burke.
How would you say that the American Indian movement parallels the black movement during the past decade? And can you indicate some of the significant events from your viewpoint as an American Indian that you feel have been really foremost in the development of the American Indian rights, such as legislation, legal litigation, protests, whatever this might be?
Oh, wow.
Why don't we just start with, are there some ways that you think that the Indian movement parallels the black movement, or do you think that they're very different? Is your leadership similar? Do you have one leader? Do you have organizational leaders that you feel have been foremost in the movement?
We have many well-known Indian people who have taken active parts in both activist kinds of activities and also behind the scenes quiet activities. We do not have any central spokesman who speak for all Indians. I would not speak for anyone but myself. I think most Indian people feel the same way. And while we may respect certain people who are more noted or known and their opinions, we wouldn't necessarily agree or allow them to say, hey, this is what the Indian people want and say. I think we could give them support. I think that we could not say anything without condemning them. You know, being quiet and let them have their say, but we wouldn't contest it, but we wouldn't support it either. I guess perhaps the blacks had a different reason for having the activist movements, would be the way I would see it. And that we perhaps took a cue from that when we finally determined that we have rights too, and we don't like violence, because basically we are non-warlike, and we don't like violence. We are compassionate people, and after a while, some of the young said, but turning the face too often is enough, and we have a right, and let us be heard. And they did indeed do that. Alcatraz, of course, Wounded Knee in Fort Lawton, Pitt River, and some of the other places. We always tried not to have violence, though, really, in all of those occupations. They tried not to have violence. And it's still a philosophy not to have violence.
I would like to ask you one more question in this area, too. We certainly are familiar in the non-Indian world of the movement for women's rights and what's happening in NOW organization. Speaking as a American Native woman, what has been the role of women among American Indians in recent years? How would you, are there any parallels with the movement such as NOW?
My own feeling is that our Indian women have always been free within our own communities. We've never felt any kind of a prejudice except in the non-Indian community. And any prejudice we probably felt there was because we were Indian and not really because we're women. Our women have always been equals with the men. We never have any of that, you're a man, I'm a woman, blah, 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 you can do this, I can do that, kind of thing. We each have a responsibility to the world in which we live, and we share that equally. And if I can do it better, then he allows me to do it better. If he can do it better, then he does it better. We recognize each other's strengths and abilities, and we allow that. And we don't, I just don't see us having any fights over it. I just don't see it in the Indian community. And we probably have many, many single head of household women today who could very easily fall into the trap of being anti-male establishment kind of thinking. But in my experience with the young people today, I don't think they look at it that way. I think they look at that perhaps they've had a bad marriage, and that their responsibilities now are to their families, and they work with that. And we don't look on them with any shame or misgivings, or that they're a female chauvinist. I think that we look on them of carrying out the responsibilities that they have to take care of.
Lee, I want to pursue another question before I turn the panel. I had lunch with you and one of your friends, and I must say, in all honesty, it was a tremendous enjoyment to me. And during that conversation, I was most impressed with your comments about all peoples of the world, about the question, how does an individual, regardless of race or color or whatever, learn to live a true and full life? What are some of those things that can make a very happy, full, and complete life for an individual?
Did you write down what I told you earlier?
It was most wonderful, and I was hoping you would share it with our viewers.
I guess the basic feeling that I have is you have to start with a spiritual way, and you have to have brotherhood. When you think of sharing and giving to others, there's no greater feeling than that. I think that you have to be concerned about your brother. And when you are, he's concerned about you. And that in doing that, you build for a future with love and compassion for everyone. And it won't make any difference whether they're male or female or young or old or what color or anything else. There's room enough for all, and we all should work at being brothers, really, following the Great Spirit. Spirituality is very important. I don't apostolize, but I think that there is one thing that holds this whole earth here, and that's the Great Spirit. And that if we respect Him, respect our fellow man, we can all live in harmony.
Thank you. Mary Lou.
Following along that line, there have been some interesting attempts in Montana to get farmers and environmentalists and Indians together in working in coalition in order to save, well, they consider save their land from the coal stripping. Do you have any comments to make of observations you have on how successful these coalitions have been, and how do the Indians really feel that they can trust the environmentalists and the farmers in the dealings with the government and with Peabody Coal and the railroads? Is there hope for this kind of a brotherhood?
Well, we have to start someplace. And something is better than nothing as long as it's positive. And so we have to start trusting, and they have to start trusting us. We can't do it alone, and we recognize that neither one of them can do it alone either. And so perhaps by utilizing the abilities or the know-how, the technology of all of us together, working together, then maybe we can beat out the system. So far, I don't think we've had too much success, because the old thing, money talks, is still pretty strong. It does talk. And the money companies still control. A good example of that is the oil situation. They tried to introduce a bill in Congress within the last few weeks that would stop the monopoly of oil companies, stop them from forcing small business out. And it never made the ground. So you see, we keep trying, but all they can do is rustle a few papers, and the money is still going to be the controlling factor. There is hope, because within the prophecies, in the end, we're all going to be Indian. You know, the world is going to, this country is going to get back to God and nature. They're going to get back to brotherhood, and they're going to be living the kind of lives that the Great Spirit intended us to. That's what the prophecies say, and I believe that.
Well, how do you feel that the white man, or a group in this case, can regain the trust of the Native Americans? What can they do to show that they are straightforward, that they are once again not speaking with forked tongue?
Well, by dealing honestly, by being truthful and being open. And by that I mean that you can't just go out and say, hey, Mr. Indian, I'm honest, I'm telling you the truth, this is really great, because that won't do it. You're going to have to live it and show it and breathe it and be it. And when you do that, everything about you is going to show that it's real, and we recognize that.
Janelle Burke.
I wonder if you might discuss with us for a minute the Indian education system. You talked earlier about the boarding schools, and I think that you might also include something about the tribal schools that now are on many reservations where there is a tribal school. Are there Indian teachers in the classrooms?
We have quite a few. Not as many as we'd like. We still have quite a ways to go. But education, in the education field, we have made probably more steps forward than in most of the other vocational fields. We have a lot of Indian teachers. They are really getting back to working with Indian children. I had 12 of my Indian students who graduated last year, and have gone back to their respective tribal areas, and are now working within the Indian Way schools. Some of them are working in the public school system, but are teaching Indian children. And that to me is real rewarding. I think we have quite a few Indian people back in teaching. I would like to see us have even more, so that, you know, whole schools where there's predominant Indian children, you have predominant Indian teachers. And certainly there's room for those who are sensitive and who care. You know, we know that they are. The average American citizen is concerned about Indian people. Problem is that he goes around with his head in the sand, and every once in a while we have to have a wounded knee to make him wake up and say, hey, look what's happening. And then they rally around and say, this can't be, you can't do this sort of thing to the people, let's get it straightened out. Then they do something. But it's kind of a hard way to go.
As you so well know from living, that the American government has made a number of treaties with your people, with the American natives over the years, and a very binding section of those treaties says that they will last as long as the water flows and the grass grows tall and green. Two questions for you. One, what are some of the violations that have taken place? And number two, is it true that recently there was an attempt in the national government to repeal all the treaties with the American natives?
Well, with violations, they have, people still try to take the land. They still use, in some areas, they use this so-called tribal councils, which are puppet councils. This is in certain areas, certain tribes who have these problems, and they deal with money-making organizations and allow certain activities on the reservations which normally wouldn't be allowed. Also, the government has confiscated land on the reservation. Like during World War II, the confiscated land said they needed it for military maneuvers or whatever. And then after the war, they were to return the land. After the war, that never happened, and they retained the land. So that took off part of the reservation, cut it down smaller. Only 2 or 3 places have been able to secure the land back. one of them was the returning of Mount Adams here at the Yakima Nation. Others, I know personally of a case where a man lived adjacent to an Indian man on a reservation, allotted land. He moved his fence over 1/2 acre the first year. He went down and filed and included it within his property boundaries, and the old man complained. Nobody really paid too much attention. The fellow was quite elderly, past 80, and was quite elderly. The next year, the man moved his fence line over again and encompassed the full acre, and was going to make some expansions on his land. And at that time, it came to my attention, and also a young man who was considered a militant, but who was one who really was concerned about a fair shake for the Indian person. Anyway, he checked it out, found indeed that the fence had been moved over 1 acre, that this man was about to again include it within his property description and pay taxes on it, and they did take him to court. They took him to court, and they stopped him from taking the full acre, but the judge said since he had already got the first half and was included in his land description, they would allow him to keep it. And so while they saved the last half, the first half was gone. They raised quite a bit of stink about it and called the attention, and people watched very carefully what was happening around them and had land surveyed, etc. But it just shows that this kind of thing still happens. And the fellow who took it said, well, if you don't try, you know, how do you know what you can gain? Which is really kind of a poor thing to me. I just wouldn't do that to anyone. The other, I have a very good friend who is a medicine man, and he was in Washington, D.C. in the time of the legislature was held. This was about 2 years ago. And from the floor, one of the senators stood up and made a motion that Congress void the treaties with the American Indians and thereby eliminate their Indian problem. And when he had finished making his motion, a representative from Russia stood up and said they would be happy to see that motion go through, that they would support it, and that they wish the Indian people to notify them who they could contact, because Russia, would like to establish treaties with the Native Americans and would help them in any project that they found that they wanted to carry out. And also several other countries did it. After this great deal of discussion, the senator stood up and withdrew his motion. Congress makes treaties, and treaties are made at a time at the end of wars. We made treaties with Russia. We've made treaties with Japan and England and Germany, and we have recognized and stood by those treaties. We made treaties with the American Indian, and true, we lost the war too. But those treaties are binding. The government made them in good faith. We signed them in good faith, and by gosh, they should be taken and respected and carried out as law, because they are law.
Thank you. Mary Lou Reed.
One area of controversy to many people around here is what is called the Judge Bolt decision. I believe it has to do with fishing rights. Do you have any comments about the Indians' feelings about their fishing rights? Are these tied into treaties?
Yes, the fishing rights are tied right into the treaties. In nearly every treaty that I have ever read, it usually has some basic things. And one of them is that they will educate your children for all generations to come, free education. And the other one is, that you would retain your right to hunt and fish and gather berries in all usual and accustomed places, because you see, you were denied the opportunity to hunt and fish when you were put into reservation areas where there was none available. So if they removed you from a location where you no longer could reach these things in order to sustain yourself, then they had to allow you the right to go back to that particular area and secure the food that was necessary to live. I don't remember those just off the top of my head, but that's really what the law says. And the judge, in reading it, he has to make a legal interpretation. And the only thing he can do is interpret the law as the law is written. And the law specifically says you will be allowed to hunt and to fish in all usual and accustomed places as long as the grass grows.
Well, some of our upstream fishermen are feeling like they're blaming the Indians for the fact that they aren't catching their fish. Do you feel that this is fair, and perhaps there are other reasons like dams that are...
Yes, I think there are many, many reasons, and I
back.
think they have waited too long to holler about it. Indian have tried to holler about conservation long, long ago, and he has continued to raise his voice about conservation, but the white man has chosen to ignore that. He should be concerned about dams. He should be concerned about the pollution of the waters. Some of the rivers are within 1 degree of not sustaining life, and that means all fish or any kind of life in that water is dead. 1 degree. Many of the areas, they have taken out a lot of floodplains, and that where life can be carried on, you know, from sea life. They fish eggs and all that stuff. They've taken out those kinds of areas, rechanneled rivers. They've dug up old spawning beds, getting gravel. And another thing that I think that people have really not paid enough attention to, and that is your foreign fishing just off the coast. Fishing ships have been seen coming right in, almost up on the beaches, scraping the very bottom, taking every kind of sea life out of there, with big mother tenders standing just offshore where they can it up right away. These foreign fishing fleets are taking the fish before they ever hit the river mouths to go up to lay the eggs. You've got to do something about that. There are more things involved than just a handful of Indian people who are doing a little fishing on the river.
Lee, with that, I want to bring our program to conclusion, and on behalf of the panel, I want to say how much I thank you. When I wrote George Carlson Associates about your coming, I said we were looking forward to it, and that desire to have you has been certainly justified. You've done a beautiful job, and we appreciate it very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I thank our panel for outstanding questions. Ladies and gentlemen, our guest this evening has been Lee Piper, who has been speaking to us about American natives and their rights. May I take this opportunity to invite you to be with us on Channel 7 again next Saturday evening at 6 o'clock, when again we'll be interviewing a personality of the Northwest or the United States. And until that time, good evening.
The North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at this same time each week over this station. The preceding student production was brought to you by videotape recording.